All right, Jerry, I am super excited today. Why? This is a breakstone for us. First time we have our guest not coming out of the HR side of the house, although he has HR thoughts, which we'll get into, but a senior business executive, my good buddy Vik Atal, is here with us today.
Great guest.
And
Thank you so much, Vic.
Thank you.
We're going to get a unique perspective from this gentleman that's going to say, as a business senior, what is he looking for as it relates to talent from earlier career right on through? Vic and I worked together for a while at Citi, but I'm not going to steal his thunder. Vic, you're on. An introduction.
Well, with that setup, right, that's pretty scary. But looking forward to the conversation very much, right? I was thinking about, obviously a long career arc, right, and how to sort of frame it for our conversation, and thinking about the sort of activities and the choices one makes. The career really took on 4 elements that framed it, right? One was the choices I made. A second was externalities that sort of came along, through time. Mm-hmm. A third was serendipity. Stuff that just happened, right? And the fourth really was towards the sort of latter end of the career, was the reputation, the networking, and the branding that you had, right? And how that influenced, elements of the career, right? So if I sort of track back to the very earlier stages, the first choice I made coming out of high school was to follow a passion, and that passion was mathematics, not because it had any practical application for a job. I had no idea what mathematics would lead to, but I just enjoyed maths, and I said, I'm going to do an undergrad, let's do it in a subject I like. So I ended up doing mathematics. At the end of the graduation, I was going to continue with studies in India, and then externalities hit, right? In the 70s, India was going through a very difficult political environment and also a very difficult economic environment. And my parents felt that, in that circumstance, it's best if you moved abroad, right? So I had no particular aspirations to go abroad. In fact, my dad helped fill out the application form for universities in Britain. And lo and behold, one day I get an envelope inviting me to study at the London School of Economics, right?
Great school.
So, what's wrong with that?
Yeah.
So off to London, right?
At least it was a good school.
Well, it was a decent school that my dad applied to.
What if it was Burger King University? Would you have gone?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that. So I went off to London, studied economics there, then graduated, and then did my chartered accountancy, which is a very demanding set of courses. And in that process, I sort of developed over time a relationship with a lady that was studying in the U.S. So as I was finishing my chartered accountancy, I was driven and desperate to get to the U.S., right, to sort of stay on and have a relationship with her. And that wasn't an easy thing to sort of, just come from London to the U.S., right? So I came to the U.S. on a vacation, and while I was here, I dropped in, I invited myself to a number of accounting firms, right, and said, look, I'm here, and I'd like to get a job here. And they said, it doesn't work like that. Go back to London and look for, if there's a program. So Pricewaterhouse had a program, and they invited, or they recruited 6 individuals from around the world on an annual basis, mid-career, into the U.S. From English-speaking countries, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, probably a little bit from Canada maybe, and Britain. So I applied for the program. I was interviewing in London on a afternoon, right, maybe 4 o'clock or something London time, and the partner was from New York. And so we're having this conversation just like we're chatting here, and after about 20 minutes, he says to me, well, hypothetically, if you were offered a job with this program, where in the U.S. would you like to be based, right? And I thought to myself, this is what does that mean, right? And so I was very careful, right? I said, listen, I'm very flexible. I was desperate to get to any place in the U.S., right? Very flexible, but I'd love to be on the East Coast. I didn't tell him that I was dating somebody that was studying on the East Coast. And he said, really, you want to go to the East Coast? Whereabouts? And I said, well, you know what? I'm sure everybody that wants to go there wants to go to New York. So New York obviously would be there, but any other city on the East Coast, right? And he looks at me and he stops the interview. He picks up the phone and he calls somebody. And he says, I got one.
Meaning you?
I don't know, right?
You want?
So then he puts the phone down, he starts laughing, and he says, listen, you know what, I've been here interviewing for 2 days. I've interviewed, dozens of people, and you are the first person that I have spoken to that is interested in coming to New York.
Really?
Wow.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, that's fantastic. So anyway, so the interview finished. He didn't offer me a job on the spot, right? And a couple of weeks later, I got invited
awesome.
to come to New York, so I ended up in New York, right? And it turns out other people went to Newport Beach and much more sort of fun places, right? But it turned out to be great, right? And then, so I came to America, right? Joined Price Waterhouse here, spent some time, and then, a few years later, got headhunted into Citibank. Had a wonderful long career at Citi.
27 years.
27 years.
Years.
That we were at Citi, and
yeah.
probably a dozen of them, we were
Yeah,
together
yeah.
as
Absolutely.
as peers and
Remember it
colleagues
well.
and team members. It was like fantastic. And then in the probably about 10, 15 years ago, I felt that my career at Citi had come to a point where I was no longer growing, no longer really getting sort of driven, and I wasn't passionate about what I was being asked to do. Citi was going through a lot of changes at that time also. And I left. I decided, what, it's not worthwhile, picking up the check, every 2 weeks, right? If you're not really sort of driven by motivated by what it takes. I left. And, one thing led to another. I was, I did some consulting work for a major consulting company. One day I got a call from a headhunter that said, would you be interested in joining a board of this company? And I'd never heard about the company before. I said, sure, I'll explore it. So I did that. Don't know who made the reference, right, for me to be, introduced to the headhunter. Never found out. She never told me, who had made the intro. Ended up joining the board. And then, a few years ago, I was still on the board. One day the chairman called me up and said, that we are looking to make a change at the senior most level of the company. The board's been having discussions about it. Obviously, I had been very much privy to all of that. And he said, we've decided that we'd like to offer you the job, right?
As the CEO.
As the CEO.
Yep.
So I stepped down to it took me 15 seconds to say yes. I did not even actually talk to my wife about it. It was just such a fantastic opportunity. I said, you know what? She'll come along for the ride.
Right.
And it's been great. So I did that for a few years, retired at the end of last year, and now, back playing golf and relaxing and doing some travel and all that.
Playing
You're
some
still
good golf.
You still act as a board member.
I am a
on
board
some-
member
a few places, yeah.
on Goldman Sachs Bank holding company. That's very engaging and sort of been a sort of lesson in learning a lot about investment banking and topics that I probably was not that familiar with through my career. But all of these things added up together, right, has made for a fantastically rewarding career arc, right?
Yeah.
And so I think you've got to just leave yourself open to whatever happens. You cannot cannot pre-plan.
But out of all that experience, Vik, what thing can you point to that you can say, if that didn't happen, it would have affected the way I lead?
The way he leads.
The way I lead?
Leads.
Actually, there were a couple of seminal moments along my career that I look back on that frame the way that I lead and what I focus on, right? Both good and bad, right? The first one was sort of early in my career. I was on a internal management program, and there were probably 30, 40 of us there. We were split up into groups, and we did this exercise that I'm sure, Jerry, you and Bill may have been part of, where you crash land on some, sort of island somewhere or the other, right? You have, 10 items, right, that you got to figure out what is the most important, right, from a flashlight to a pen and a paper and all that, right?
Yeah.
And we were in groups, and there were like 6 of us in the group, and we all had to make our individual list, and we had to make a group list, right? And then we were scored, right? So in our group, there were 5 men and 1 lady. So we all made our list. when the scoring was done, our group came last, right? But our lady was first, right? And it stuck with me to say, and they filmed it. They filmed that session, and they played the film back for us. And at every point that the lady started to chirp about something, one of us, right, macho men would jump in, right, cut her off and not listen, right?
Right.
And it stuck with me to say, you need to be listening, you need to be taking care of everybody, right, in the room. And it's not about women. Of course, it is about women, but it's beyond that. It's about every participant needs to do that, right? So that was one moment that stuck with me in terms of defining the way that I'd like to think. I've tried to embrace people and say, come into the room and let's talk about it.
Sure. Significant.
The second thing was, on a negative side, I was, when I was at one of the jobs I had at Citi, my role expanded quite dramatically, quite quickly. I ended up managing 3 or 4 different divisions, and I had just become a manager at Citi. So I was moving from being what you would call an individual contributor into a management role, right? And a natural bias was to throw yourself harder and harder at the problem, right? To say, okay, well, I'm working like 10 hours a day, now I'm working 12 hours a day, now I'm working 14 hours a day. Anyway, so I was working like crazy hours, trying to do too many things. And one of my responsibilities was to be the person that was responsible for preparing materials to go out to the board of the company. And so edits were coming in. I was managing the edits about, the different sort of documents that need to be redrafted. It was like overwhelming. At the end of the day, the deadline hit. I shipped the documents out. And when I was looking at them that night, I realized we'd shipped out documents to the board that had multiple edits and errors on it, right?
Oops.
So that was like maybe at 9 o'clock at night, right? We'd hit the last FedEx package, right? The last FedEx that goes out is 9 o'clock. So I had to sort of package it up, send it out, read it at 10 o'clock, said, oh my God, right? Next morning, right, I get to work. First thing I do is go to see John Reed, who was the chairman of the company.
Chairman, yeah.
Right? And go to see his secretary. Secretary said, what's happening? And I said, I got to see the boss. She says, like, he's got no time for you. I said, no, I got to see him, right? So I said, just take a minute. I go in there. I tell John, I said, John, I was reviewing the materials, and there's some edits. We need to change it. And he didn't bat an eyelid. He said, anything critical? I said, no, not critical, but like it's sloppy, right? And anyway, I went away. I made the edits. It went up. He never mentioned it again. But it taught me that to advance your career, you need to focus on the team and the people, and you need to start, stopping being a player. You need to start being a coach, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a number of lessons that I took from that, right? About focusing on talent, focusing on changing what actually brings value to the table, right? And so those are 2 sort of seminal items, and there may be others along the way.
In our pre-discussion with you, one of the things that struck me, and you articulated about it, for our early career listeners out there, the differences between your academic life while you're at university, what's important as you achieve, right, versus corporate life. And there's so many differences. You had a very, very interesting insight around that. For our listeners out there, what changes?
Oh, I think, well, it's right, but everything changes, right?
Yeah.
Right.
I think all of us, right, including the listeners, right, have spent 20 years, probably 18, 20 years from the age of 3 or 4, right, to early 20s, in a highly structured environment, right, where the measurements are mostly objective, not at the age of 4 and 5 when you're in kindergarten, but as you get into grade 1, 2, 3, 4, everybody's measuring you, right? And it's a very defined curriculum that you're following, right? So you know what you need to know, right? And at the end of the day, you're tested on it, and you score well or badly, right? There's a scorecard, right? So you know exactly where you are relative to, your own aspirations, relative to all of your peers, right? And it's very clear, right? And you get into the workforce, and it's unstructured. There's no curriculum, right? It's like, open-ended, right? It's subjective, right? There's not, and you're not being measured just by your teacher, your class teacher or your principal. everybody in whatever environment you're at has an opinion and a perspective on
Yeah.
you, right? Your boss, your colleagues, your peers, people that you're sort of, your juniors, right? And everybody in the company, right? And so in that environment, the mechanisms you need to succeed, right, and to satisfy, your aspirations are different, right? It's not just about acing the test, right?
Right.
It's about, shifting from focusing on what I like to call IQ to really EQ, right? And that's really the fundamental change that happens. And then the attributes that will define success, are, the energy you bring to the table, the passion you bring to the table, the curiosity you bring to the table. Right. But these are all nebulous concepts, right? You can't
So
measure it.
what I'm hearing is nobody taught you how to handle COVID, a financial crisis, AI.
Yeah.
You sort of had to use your learnable skills to navigate.
To navigate that, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But, related to that, I'll overgeneralize, right? Sometimes that 4.0 student at an Ivy League school, sorry to pick on the Ivies, right, fail miserably in the corporate environment. Why is that?
Bill, at the end of the day, right, when was the last time anybody asked you or Jerry or me what grade we got at school, right?
Right.
I'll tell you a story about myself, right? So I finished my undergrad in Delhi, right?
Mm-hmm. Is that where you're from, by the way? Is that where you grew up?
No, I grew up in Calcutta.
Calcutta.
That's where my parents were based.
Yeah.
But I was studying in Delhi. And when I finished, right, I went to the Delhi School of Economics a few days before this letter came from the London School of Economics. And I asked the registrar there, registrar is the guy that gives you the admission papers, for an application form for the Delhi School of Economics. And he looks at me and he says, so what grades did you get in your mathematics, right? And I told him. He said, then no application form. I said, what do you mean no application form? He says, with those grades, no application form. So
Meaning you're good, or?
No, meaning like I'm not even good enough to get an application form,
Uh-huh.
let alone, right? Okay.
On the other side.
Yeah. So I walked away. I said, okay, no application form. I said, okay, I'll do a master's in something else, right? Okay. That same week, I get a letter from the London School of Economics, right? Now, my grades at undergraduate, my grades in the London School of Economics, right? Nobody asks about it, right? Other than the first job I got, right?
Right,
And then that's it, right? Okay. So IQ in the 40 years that I spent working made whatever I got in school made no difference. It was really about if I succeeded, it was because of whatever I brought to the table, in terms of the EQ component of driving a business. Right?
Yeah.
So let's
And so
talk
people
about what makes up the EQ. Give us some examples of what, the formula is for the perfect EQ, or is there one?
I don't think there's a perfect EQ, right? I think it's like EQ is such an expansive concept. Right? I mean, you guys are professionals at that, right? So
Sometimes, right?
you are right. But I would say it's Jerry. It's a combination of factors that you would bring to the table, right? Mm-hmm. You need to be empathetic. Mm-hmm. You need to be listening, right? You need to be curious, right? Curious about the what, right, and the who, right, and ask the next level of questions, right? Need to demonstrate lateral thinking as opposed to just sort of like straightforward, like what else could be influencing what's going on here. Mm-hmm. You need to bring passion and energy, and I talk about integrity not in a way of saying that you got to be honest. It's got to be like you got to be true to yourself, right? Mm-hmm. So you got to be authentic, and it came up many times in careers where I observed people not being willing to tell the story the way it needed to be told, right? Trying to color it, right? And saying, okay, like, who am I speaking to? Well, okay, I'm speaking to Jerry. Well, Jerry likes to hear it this way, so let me tell you. No, tell it to him the way it needs to be told, right?
Right.
So people can make decisions, right?
Right.
And that's, those things are either you've learned some of that as you're growing up, right? Mm-hmm. Your parents and your school and your environment teaches it. You need to just continue to amplify that, right? And take lessons from everybody. You learn about it. You see people, you observe people behaving in a certain way, and if they're behaving in the way that you think is right, then you sort of embrace that and say, yeah, that's a good thing. I need to follow that, right?
Right, because there are employees, young professionals. Some people are faced with a issue or a problem, they freeze. Some adapt and lead. What makes the difference? Is it the skills that they get throughout life, throughout college? Can college teach you those skills?
I think colleges don't necessarily teach you those skills, right? The environment at college can teach you those skills, right? You know, who are the people you associate with at college? You know, how do you build up a network at college? How do you actually, and how do you get outside your core focus areas, right? So if you're studying, you know, let's say computer science at college, right? You'll meet a set of people that are wired a certain way, right? How do you step away from that and try to identify opportunities where you will meet people with a different skill set, right? You know, maybe you sort of, you know, join a music program. You don't have to become a musician. You can just say, I enjoy listening to music, so let me join something, right? Get involved with a not-for-profit. Get involved with community groups, right? So broaden out your horizons. That will start expanding, you know, your EQ in that way. It'll also help you expand in a dramatic way your network and your relationships. Right?
I love how you frame it as EQ, because the flavor of the day is core competencies, right? We talk about this all the time. They tell us, oh, there are 8 core competencies that employers look for. But really what they're looking for is the EQ, right? Nobody can say, well, you're a good communicator. That's the first core competency. That's the most important to us. But how do you teach somebody to be a great communicator in 4 years of college? Can you? I mean, you can give some guidelines, you can give some hints, you can teach people how to network a little bit.
Yeah. And I would think, I don't know, Jerry, yourself and Bill, you're involved in a lot of activity with younger people, right, in college and all that. I would say what I observe is many college students are waiting until their 3rd or 4th year in college to start thinking about what they need to be doing next, right?
Right.
They need to be doing. I've tried to influence and encourage my own kids to be thoughtful about this even before they got to college, right? You know, start building relationships. And I tell people, don't come to me asking me for a job. I don't have any jobs to give.
Right.
And that, it makes me very defensive. You come and say, well, you know, Vik, what about a job? I can't give a job, right? Okay. But I would say what I've observed is many people, most of us, right, who have been in careers for a while, right, would be more than open to providing input and advice, right?
Sure.
You know,
And even connections.
and connections potentially, right?
sure.
But connections follow. My brand extends to who I am promoting as an extension, right? You know, if you said to me, as even now, you said to me, well, I have somebody, right, Michael, that I'd like you to introduce. I said, I'm not going to introduce Michael. I don't know who Michael is, right?
Right.
If I get to know Michael, right, I'm happy to chat to him. I'll spend 15 minutes with him. If I get to know Michael and over time, I might be confident enough to say, okay, like this Michael would be a good person to connect with XYZ, right? And we make connections all the time, right? But making those connections also only happens after you get to know the person well enough that you are confident that, you know, because if I start making random connections, right, the next connection I make is going to fall on the floor, right?
Right.
So we got to be very careful. So people, younger people need to know that like they need to invest time early as possible in building these relationships, developing relationships, asking for advice, asking for input, studying a program. They should be saying, you know, where could I take this? How do I sort of, you know, and because it helps them with their sort of internships. It might help them with a job. It might help them with connection. So you got to take like a longitudinal view on this, right? Not just, you know, come and say like, I want a job now, right?
You know, and to that point, one of the other comments you made to us that I noted is it has to go beyond work, right? The broadening of that network in all walks of life, because you never know who's going to open up that door, right?
And I would say, if you ask me, you know, is there something that I did late in my career, or you know, that I should have done early?
Yeah,
it was broadening my network, right? I was so intently focused on my job at Citi that I did not spend enough time broadening my network, right? And then, through a fortuitous set of circumstances, my daughter was in my younger daughter was in a youth chorus, and they the chorus director invited me to join the board, and I said I won't do it while my daughter's there because it's a potential conflict of interest. But the minute I stopped, I joined the chorus. I have no tone, I have no music ability, right? But I joined the chorus, and through that, I suddenly found myself, meeting with a completely random set of people, right? That actually cared not a jot about what I did at Citibank, right? On the role I had, right? It was just about, hey, I was a good guy. I was fun to be with, right? I was supporting the chorus, right? And I am, like 3 degrees removed from, separation removed from Wynton Marsalis and Renee Fleming, just like it's amazing, right? And I'm at, amazing opportunities. So that was one. And the second was that I joined a private golf club about 20 years ago. Not with the perspective of building a network, but I love golf, and I quickly got actually sucked in, right, to governance at the club, and I contribute. I felt that if I was going to be there, I wasn't just there to like take from the golf club. I'd like to give back as well. So I did that, and through that, I developed a network that is like so much broader than anything that happened at Citi, right? There's lawyers and doctors and all sorts of other professional people there, and they again don't care about what I did at work. They only care about, hey, am I a good guy to be out on the golf course with, right? And all that, and that's been really rewarding, right?
So the message on that, and golf is a perfect example at a golf club or whatever, but to a young person out there, I often get the feedback that to some it's kind of awkward, to reach out and not want to be perceived as asking for something. How does a young person establish themselves, to your point, to build and expand that network without feeling, oh, they're going to judge me because really all I'm looking for is an entry in for a job? How do you make the distinction?
Because you got to do it, Bill. You got to do it. Keep it distinct from a job. It'll come naturally to you, right? It'll come naturally to people, right? To say, I'm here, right? I'm involved. I'm engaged, and it doesn't have to be, being on a board in a not-for-profit or joining a golf club. People might say, well, that's an expensive endeavor, right? I got to commit to throwing, right? Most not-for-profits are really desirous of having volunteers helping out. Everybody needs help, right? Okay.
Right.
So find something that interests you, put yourself out there, get involved with people over there. You never know who you're going to meet, right? But every single interaction that you have there, every single interaction will auto-reinforce your personal brand, right? And you don't know who is going to come out of there and be positive. You cannot be so explicit about saying, well, I'm going to reach out to Jerry because Jerry can help you. No, it's not Jerry. Jerry may not be able to help you, but Jerry has got 100 friends, and Jerry might say, I can't help you, but hey, you know what, let me connect you with so-and-so, or let me make it. Or even he might say to somebody, hey, I met a wonderful kid, right, at this thing. Right? And that's how these things happen. Right?
And everybody has a value, right? We talk about that in the book.
Yeah.
We talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
You can give anybody value. You can bring value to any relationship. You just have to understand what it is. So if I want to talk to Vik and I want to have a relationship with him, I don't have to say, hey, I want to have a relationship with you because I need a job. I can say, is there a charity that you volunteer for? Tell me more about your music board. And I can volunteer, and now I'm giving value, right? And eventually that relationship will evolve so that, number one, you don't feel bad asking for value in return because you've already given it.
Yeah.
And you may not have to ask.
Look, there's so many levels at which this happens, right? Because it's not about, it goes back to being empathetic and thinking about how you can be helping others, right? So, somebody might need eventually, right, might be eventually searching for a job and building a set of networks, right? But what can they give back, right?
Right.
If let's say they're at the golf club, let's say they're at the music program, right? if they're a decent golfer, are they, willing to like play with my kids, right? Are they willing to like teach somebody something, right? Do they like, so there's any infinite number of ways that you can demonstrate this, right? How do you be thoughtful about it and not be linear about how you think about this stuff, right?
Yeah, but it's a learned skill. I mean, you mentioned the EQ and the importance, right? As a young person, they think about, oh, are they going to perceive me as asking for something? But those that understand what we're talking about, they'll build authenticity and genuineness that will serve them very well. But it is for young people today, especially those, we talk often about the COVID years and, the lack of that exposure during those years. So it's been a bit of a gap, but those that understand, and you also said, start early on all that, right?
You got to start early, right? I think, I think schools need to be in some way encouraging this as well, right? And say like, beyond the academics, right? You need to be helping people develop these social skills, right?
Yeah.
Of people, right?
Yeah, yeah.
By the time you get to college, I mean, college can be helpful, right? But time passes very quickly, right? And
Yeah.
I think so. I encourage people, anybody younger, family, friends, younger people, nephews, nieces, etc., right? Get on it and get on it
Early.
quickly, right?
Early.